Legendary artist Banksy may have finally been identified. For decades, the anonymous street artist has managed to keep his identity hidden while creating some of the most recognizable and politically charged artwork in the world. But a new investigation claims to have come closer than ever to confirming who's behind the name. Researchers analyzed years of evidence, including the location of artworks, travel patterns, and even past arrests tied to vandalism, and found they consistently aligned with a man named Robin Gunningham, a British man from Bristol who has long been suspected of being Banksy. Some of the strongest evidence comes from geographic profiling, a technique often used in criminal investigations, which mapped where the artworks appeared and linked them to his known whereabouts. The investigation suggests the timing and placement of multiple pieces matches known movements, strengthening the theory that he's indeed the artist behind the legendary street art. However, Banksy's team has refused to confirm the claims, and his lawyer disputes key details in the investigation, leaving his identity officially unverified. Before he became Wolverine, Hugh Jackman was a struggling actor working kids' birthday parties as a clown named Coco, earning about $50 a gig. He's admitted he didn't even know any real magic tricks and was once told by a 6-year-old, "You're terrible." Jackman has said those early performances forced him to learn how to command a room, handle rejection, and keep entertaining no matter what, skills that would later define his stage and film career. In 1946, French designer Louis Réard named the bikini after Bikini Atoll, where the United States had just conducted atomic bomb tests. He chose the name deliberately, claiming the revealing swimsuit would have an explosive cultural impact similar to the atomic blast that had just shocked the world. Sylvester Stallone wrote the script for Rocky in about 3 days after watching underdog boxer Chuck Wepner go the distance with Muhammad Ali. At the time, Stallone was struggling financially and reportedly had less than $200 in his bank account. Studios offered to buy the script but wanted a major star in the lead role. Stallone refused any offers unless he could play Rocky himself. He took a significantly smaller payday to secure the role, a gamble that paid off when Rocky won the Academy Award for Best Picture and launched his career. In 2018, a man from Rhode Island returned from his vacation in Costa Rica with severe migraines and facial paralysis, initially thought to be a brain tumor. But instead, doctors discovered a rare black mold growing inside his brain, forming dangerous abscesses. The fungus, found in soil, is known for attacking the brain and carries a mortality rate of around 70%, with early cases historically being almost always fatal. Since 1911, only about 120 cases have ever been recorded worldwide. The infection likely entered his body during the trip and slowly spread to his brain, causing several strokes and neurological damage. Because of its location deep in the brain, the mold couldn't be fully removed, but after extensive treatment, the man miraculously managed to survive. In April of 2011, French aristocrat Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès killed his wife, 4 children, and the family's 2 dogs inside their home in Nantes using a .22 caliber rifle while they slept. Investigators later found the victims wrapped in plastic and buried beneath the terrace, alongside religious items and letters suggesting he had carefully planned the murders before withdrawing money, abandoning his car in southern France, and vanishing without a confirmed trace. Despite an international manhunt, sightings, and several false leads over the years, he's never been located, leaving the case one of France's most disturbing unsolved family murder mysteries, with authorities still uncertain whether he escaped abroad, lives under a false identity, or died shortly after disappearing. This was the terrifying moment a textile factory worker suddenly got pulled into a rope winding machine. As the machine spun, the rope wrapped around his leg and dragged him toward the rollers in a split second. Luckily, the coworker by his side quickly hit the emergency stop just in time, likely saving him from a horrific death. Someone in Birmingham, Alabama was suddenly woken up by this life-threatening scene, a massive branch that crashed through their roof during intense storms. In something straight out of Final Destination, they were only feet away from being impaled in their sleep. This was the intense moment a foundry worker unknowingly dumped wet scrap metal into a furnace using a forklift. When water touches molten metal, it instantly flashes into steam and expands violently, triggering a powerful steam explosion. Immediately after the scrap is dumped, the furnace erupts in a sudden burst of steam and molten metal. The driver's forklift is briefly surrounded by the splash, but he miraculously manages to reverse away and somehow avoids any serious injuries. In Gainesville, Georgia, a group of high school students decided to prank their math teacher by toilet papering his yard late at night. When 40-year-old teacher and golf coach Jason Hughes ran outside, He was reportedly joking around and pretending to catch them in the act as they ran back to their car. But as the teens tried to speed away, Hughes slipped on the wet pavement and fell into the road. One of the students, an 18-year-old driving a pickup truck, accidentally ran him over. Hughes was rushed to the hospital but tragically died from his injuries. The driver was initially charged with first-degree vehicular homicide, while several other students were arrested for trespassing and littering. But Hughes's family later asked prosecutors to drop the charges, saying the beloved teacher cared deeply about his students and never would have wanted any of their lives destroyed over a prank. This was the moment a man desperately tried to force his way through a secured airport door after claiming he needed to see his dying father immediately. On January 1st, 2024, 30-year-old Kyler Effinger breached security at Salt Lake City International Airport after forcing his way through an emergency exit and running straight onto the restricted airfield. Effinger had already checked in and had a boarding pass for a flight to Denver, but for reasons that remain unclear, he suddenly bypassed security procedures and ran straight onto the tarmac instead. He told staff he was desperately trying to reach his father, who he believed was dying. Moments later, he ran across the airfield and climbed into the intake of a Delta Airbus A220 engine, while the aircraft was parked on a de-icing pad with the engine still rotating. The spinning turbine quickly pulled him in, killing him almost instantly from catastrophic blunt force injuries. Police later found his mangled body partially inside the engine. Kyler's grieving family later said he'd been experiencing a severe bipolar episode at the time. In March of 1998, 13-year-old Tristan Brubach left school in Frankfurt complaining of a backache and walked through the Liederbach pedestrian tunnel, a dim underpass children commonly used as a shortcut. While inside the tunnel, he was attacked and murdered in an extremely brutal assault. Investigators determined that the killer cut his throat so deeply that the wound reached his spine and nearly severed his head. After the killing, the attacker mutilated the body, removing Tristan's privates and taking them from the scene. Blood evidence suggested the killer remained in the tunnel for some time, staging the body and possibly washing himself in the nearby stream. Shortly after the murder, a man called police and calmly confessed, providing details only the killer would know. But when officers rushed to the tunnel, the caller had already disappeared. Despite decades of investigation, DNA analysis, and multiple suspects, Tristan's killer has never been identified. The Liederbach tunnel where the murder occurred was sealed off later that year and has remained closed ever since. This is why you should never dump your pet goldfish in the wild. A goldfish weighing 30 kilograms, about 67 pounds, was pulled from a lake in France after growing to an enormous size. Goldfish can reproduce rapidly, creating entire populations of invasive fish that overwhelm local ecosystems. Some lakes have reported thousands of them multiplying beneath the surface, unseen until the damage is already done. Without natural predators and with endless food, they grow to ridiculous sizes, churn up lake beds, rip out vegetation, cloud the water, and slowly suffocate native wildlife. In 2002, Washington State mother Lydia Fairchild nearly lost custody of her own children after DNA tests appeared to prove she wasn't biologically related to them. She had applied for public assistance, and routine genetic testing showed her DNA did not match the children she had given birth to, raising suspicions of fraud. After multiple failed maternity tests, doctors discovered she was an extremely rare human chimera, meaning she had absorbed her twin in the womb and carried two distinct sets of DNA in her body. Her reproductive organs contained different genetic material than the rest of her tissues, which is why standard DNA testing falsely suggested she wasn't their mother. Rama Haruna was born in Nigeria in 1996 and appeared healthy at birth, but at around 6 months old, she suddenly became ill and her body stopped developing normally. As she got older, most of her body stopped growing and she lost the ability to sit or stand, leaving her with a severely shortened torso and almost no functioning limbs. While her body remained extremely small, her head continued to grow and age normally, creating a striking contrast that doctors were never able to fully explain. Because she couldn't move on her own, Rama's family often carried her around in a large plastic bucket so she could leave the house. Despite constant pain, she remained mentally sharp and spoke about wanting to live a normal life. She died in 2016 at the age of 19 after living her entire life with the unexplained condition. In the 1840s, Anarcha Westcott, an enslaved black woman, was forced to undergo about 30 experimental gynecological surgeries performed by Dr. J. Marion Sims, who was later known as the father of modern gynecology. Sims was apparently trying to repair childbirth injuries called fistulas, and the procedures were carried out without anesthesia at a time when many physicians believed African Americans couldn't feel pain. Although his techniques influenced early gynecology, Anarcha has come to symbolize how much medical advancement was built on the suffering of enslaved women. Today, she's remembered as one of the mothers of gynecology, not for a discovery she chose, but for what she was forced to endure. Here's an incredible look at a 2,000-year-old Roman aqueduct that still carries water today. Hidden beneath the ruins of Smyrna Agora in Izmir, Turkey, This ancient underground channel was built during the Roman Empire to supply the city of Smyrna with fresh water. Using carefully engineered stone tunnels and gravity alone, Roman engineers directed water from nearby hills through passageways beneath the city. Remarkably, parts of the system still function nearly 2 millennia later, with water continuing to flow through the same channels built by ancient Roman engineers. Ferdinand Postman Cheval was a French mailman who spent 33 years building an enormous stone palace using nothing but the rocks he collected on his daily route. With no architectural training and only a wheelbarrow and simple hand tools, he worked night after night to assemble columns, towers, archways, and sculptures into a dreamlike structure he called the ideal palace. For the longest time, people in his village thought he was eccentric, but the finished palace was so extraordinary that France eventually declared it a National Historic Monument. For decades, self-proclaimed psychic Sylvia Browne inserted herself into missing person cases, often delivering definitive claims to grieving families that were later proven false. In 1999, she told the grandmother of 6-year-old Opal Jo Jennings, who'd been abducted in Texas, that the girl was alive and being forced into slavery in Japan. In reality, Jennings had been murdered shortly after her disappearance, and her remains were found in Texas in 2003. In 2004, Sylvia appeared on The Montel Williams Show and told the mother of missing Ohio teen Amanda Berry that her daughter was dead. The girl's mother died in 2006, thinking she'd meet up with her daughter in heaven, but Amanda was found alive in 2013 after being held captive in Cleveland for a decade. Despite repeated inaccuracies, Sylvia continued making TV appearances and charging for readings until her death in 2013. In March of 1911, after a fire tore through the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City, rows of coffins were placed on display so grieving families could try to identify their loved ones. The blaze trapped workers on the upper floors of the Ash Building, where exit doors had been locked and fire escapes quickly collapsed. With no safe way out, many young immigrant women and girls took their own lives to avoid being buried alive as crowds watched from the street below. By the time the flames were extinguished, 146 people were dead. The disaster exposed brutal factory conditions and became one of the deadliest industrial workplace tragedies in American history. In October of 2006, 18-year-old Nikki Katsouris died after crashing her father's Porsche 911 Carrera at more than 100 miles per hour on a California freeway. The impact was so catastrophic that her body remained strapped in the driver's seat, but her head was no longer attached. The scene was so graphic that the coroner advised her parents not to identify the body. But in the aftermath, 2 California Highway Patrol employees improperly leaked photographs of the accident that quickly spread across the internet, appearing on forums and shock sites. Strangers later began anonymously emailing the horrific images directly to the grieving Katsouris family. The family later pursued legal action against the California Highway Patrol, and in 2012 the state reached a settlement with them over the unauthorized release of the photos. In 1974, 6-year-old Gary Ray Hose ran away from home to escape alleged abuse from his parents. Police soon returned the boy to his household, but he was never seen again. Years later, his older brothers told investigators that their mother had beaten Gary to death shortly after he was brought back and buried his body somewhere on the family's remote desert property. Despite searches and the disturbing testimony, Gary's remains have never been found, leaving the case unresolved and the exact circumstances of his death unknown. Here's a friendly reminder of why you should always lock your doors no matter what. This disturbing ring camera footage shows a disheveled woman wearing a white dress wandering through a residential stairway in the middle of the night while holding a knife in her mouth. She paces back and forth, systematically trying apartment doors, stopping at each one to see if it's unlocked. When she realizes they're locked, she bends down and checks under the doormats, clearly searching for hidden spare keys before moving on to the next door. She even stares directly into the camera while moving from door to door, seemingly unaware or unconcerned by how terrifying she looks. Still armed, she walks up the stairs to another floor and continues scanning hallways, before reportedly lingering outside more apartments as the video cuts off. Her appearance, combined with the fact that she was half-dressed and carrying a knife in her mouth, made many people fear that she wasn't simply trespassing, but was potentially on drugs or mentally ill while actively looking for someone to hurt, showing how close a single unlocked door can come to turning into something far worse. This is the face of 87-year-old World War II veteran and daylily horticulturist Leo Sharp, who was pulled over in Michigan in 2011 after appearing confused and disoriented. A search of his vehicle uncovered more than 400 pounds of cocaine, revealing that he'd secretly spent years working as a high-level courier for Mexico's Sinaloa cartel. Because he looked so harmless and was rarely questioned, Sharp transported massive quantities of cocaine across the U.S. before being caught. He later pleaded guilty to drug trafficking charges and was sentenced to prison in his late 80s, becoming one of the oldest cartel mules ever prosecuted. In 1951, the French town of Pont-Saint-Esprit was hit by a sudden outbreak of severe illness after residents ate bread from a local bakery. Around 250 people experienced intense hallucinations, convulsions, and severe paranoia, with some reporting visions of snakes crawling out of their bodies or being consumed by flames. Several victims jumped from windows or ran screaming through the streets, while others were restrained or sedated as hospitals quickly filled beyond capacity. At least 5 people died and dozens were committed to psychiatric institutions. Investigators later concluded the outbreak was most likely caused by ergot poisoning, a toxic fungus that can contaminate rye and produce effects similar to LSD, which many historians have also theorized may have contributed to the Salem witch trials. Here's a photo of American soldier Joseph Dwyer carrying a wounded Iraqi boy away from crossfire during the Iraq War in 2003, an image that became a symbol of compassion amid chaos. After returning home, Dwyer was diagnosed with severe PTSD, became unemployed, and suffered a marital breakdown as his mental health deteriorated into paranoia and violent delusions. In 2008, after years of psychological struggle and substance abuse, Joseph Dwyer died from a drug overdose, a quiet end to a life permanently altered by the horrors of war. In 2025, 15-year-old woodworking apprentice Muhammad Kendirsi died after coworkers assaulted him with a high-pressure air hose during what they reportedly called a workplace prank. The force of the compressed air caused massive internal damage, including rupturing of his intestines and severe internal bleeding. Doctors said the sudden air pressure led to rapid organ failure and shock, and despite emergency treatment, his injuries were too extensive for him to be saved. Authorities treated the incident as a violent assault, and the case sparked massive outrage over deadly hazing and abuse in the workplace. In October of 2024 in Arizona, 9-year-old Rebecca Baptiste escaped her home by jumping out a second-story apartment window and running to a nearby gas station, where she begged strangers for help and said she was being abused by her father and his girlfriend. Police and child welfare authorities were notified, and hospital staff documented visible injuries, but officers ultimately downplayed her claims and returned her to her abusers. Over the following months, the abuse escalated until July of 2025, when Rebecca was found unresponsive along a rural highway and later died from non-accidental trauma. An autopsy revealed extreme malnourishment, extensive bruising, burns, hair loss, and other injuries consistent with prolonged torture. Her father, Richard Baptiste, and his girlfriend, Anisha Woods, were arrested and charged with murder and severe child abuse, as the case became a stark example of how a child's desperate pleas for help were ignored with fatal consequences. This was the moment when an off-duty police officer in Barcelona realized something was seriously wrong at a subway station. A young man on the platform appeared disoriented and unsteady, drifting dangerously close to the edge in a station where trains arrive every few minutes. The officer, later identified as Felisa Pozas, was off-duty but immediately recognized the risk. She walked to an emergency SOS intercom and pressed the button to alert Metro Control that someone needed help. But seconds later, the situation escalated as the man suddenly lost his balance and fell onto the tracks below. Without hesitating, Pozas ran toward him as several nearby commuters rushed in to help. Working against the clock, they grabbed him and hoisted him back onto the platform, knowing a train could enter the station at any moment. No one was seriously injured, and authorities later confirmed the man was not intoxicated. No further details about his condition have been released, but officials say the outcome could have easily been fatal if not for Pozas' awareness, her decision to act immediately, and the fact that she didn't wait for someone else to step in. Noah Schnapp has opened up about the psychological toll of playing Will Byers, a character subjected to prolonged fear, possession, and isolation starting when Schnapp was just 11 years old. He said that repeatedly filming scenes of terror and helplessness made it difficult to separate himself emotionally from the character, particularly during the earlier seasons when he was still developing emotionally. He later acknowledged that much of his early work required him to access fear and distress far beyond what most children experience at that age. But let's be honest, the real morbid fact here is that bowl cut. My God, they did him dirty. Caleb McLaughlin and Pryor Ferguson have both stated that becoming famous as children on Stranger Things exposed them to racist harassment from fans. They've said some of the harassment even escalated to messages threatening violence, including death threats, even when they were still just children. Maya Hawke has said her childhood unfolded under the shadow of a very public family collapse after her father, Ethan Hawke, had an affair with the family nanny, an event she's described as shattering her sense of stability. She grew up amid the fallout of that breakup, which she's linked to long-term anxiety and feelings of abandonment. As a child, Maya also struggled with severe dyslexia, falling so behind academically that she was eventually pulled out of school because she couldn't read at the expected level, leaving her isolated during years when structure and security were already unraveling. OF creator Bonnie Blue has been arrested in Bali after police raided a villa suspected of being used to film explicit content. 16 men were detained with her, but while most were released, Bonnie and 2 British men were held as officers seized phones and cameras based on a tip from inside the villa. She's now in immigration custody, questioned daily and without her passport, as officials prepare a court hearing and consider deportation in a long-term blacklist. Under Indonesia's morality laws, producing pornographic content can carry up to 15 years in prison. Mary Carol McDonnell, a 73-year-old former true crime TV producer, allegedly conned banks by posing as the heiress to an $80 million trust fund that never existed, securing nearly $30 million in fraudulent loans, including a $15 million payout she was never qualified to receive. But before the scheme unraveled, she completely disappeared, leaving behind a federal indictment, multiple aliases, and lenders scrambling to recover their losses. With possible ties to Los Angeles, Alabama, and Dubai, she was added to the FBI's most wanted list in 2025 as one of the country's most elusive white-collar fugitives. Winona Ryder's life has been shaped by trauma long before Stranger Things. At age 12, she was beaten unconscious by classmates who thought she looked gay, leaving her with a concussion, stitches, and lasting psychological scars. Years later, while filming Alien Resurrection, she suffered a near-fatal anaphylactic shock after reacting to a chemical used on her costume. Production halted as she was rushed for emergency treatment. By the late 90s, her mental health reportedly collapsed entirely, and in 2001, she was arrested for shoplifting thousands of dollars in designer clothes. While heavily sedated on painkillers she later admitted she'd been abusing. The fallout destroyed her career for years and forced her into a long period of therapy before she slowly resurfaced in Hollywood, a period she describes today as losing myself completely. Winona later said she felt as though the world had turned on her overnight and that the humiliation pushed her into one of the darkest depressions of her life. It took years before she finally found work again, slowly rebuilding a life she once thought might never recover. Grace Van Dien, aka Chrissy, revealed that she was groomed by a producer while working on another project, an experience she said left her traumatized enough to step away from acting entirely. She described it as one of the darkest times of her life, saying Hollywood had become unsafe for her and that the incident permanently changed how she views the industry. Before Stranger Things, Brett Gelman endured years of darkness, losing his younger brother in a sudden tragedy, spiraling through severe depression, and battling suicidal thoughts while he struggled to afford rent and avoid homelessness. He says he was quietly blacklisted in Hollywood for speaking out against abusive workplaces, leaving him convinced his career would be over before it ever started. Mark Steger, the performer inside the Demogorgon suit, has said the role was one of the most physically dangerous of his career. The practical suit trapped extreme heat, restricted movement, and weighed so much that he repeatedly suffered heat exhaustion, ligament strain, and even collapsed during takes. At one point, he collapsed so fast the crew thought he'd gone into cardiac arrest. Steger said the Demogorgon required total body endurance just to survive filming days.